Okay, so for the panel today, we've got three folks working on distinct things. That was the idea, right? Let's get some breadth, people working with different methods, kinds of data, asking different kinds of questions, and so they're all going to be sharing some, I think, some sort of maybe some new things that they're working on or thinking about, and hopefully maybe ask us some interesting questions or challenges to think about things in new ways or tackle some new problems. First up is Ariel Ortiz-Bobea. He's an assistant professor at Cornell. If you don't know him, someone who's, I think, really quickly developed a reputation in the profession for extremely careful empirical work, and also someone who I think does a really effective job of using images, graphs, things like that to really tell a story in an extremely effective way. No pressure. We've seen a lot of work he's been working on related to probably climate change in agriculture. He's taken some of this in a new direction. He's going to talk a little bit about TFP and how it links in with this, and then thinking about adaptation and challenges going forward. Thanks.
Thank you. Some warnings. Okay, great. Thank you for the introduction. Very flattering. So I'm very happy to be here. I've been trying to get into this conference for a while, and so I finally made it. So thank you for organizing this and for inviting me. So it was. When I thought about this presentation at the beginning, I was like, wow, new directions, and I think it would be a little bit pretentious for me to think about like all the new directions, that there's a lot of people doing work in this area, a lot of cool work, and even like in 10, 15 minutes, I don't have time even to talk about like all the things that I'm doing, but I'll, thinking about the audience and knowing that there's, it's a young audience, there's grad students, also junior people, I thought like, well, why don't I have, take that into account so that I tell not only just stuff that I'm doing, but also how I got started and how the directions have been shifting, right? So the backstory to that, I think it would be a worthwhile experience. Okay, so let's go back to a relevant time period, grad school, right? So this is when I basically got my, I joined the PhD program at the University of Maryland in Agri and Resource Economics in 2008, and when I got there, I had been working in government in the Dominican Republic, where I'm from, for about 2 years, and I really wanted to work on the environment, agriculture, and development, and I thought, like, I swear to God, I thought I was going to work in like climate change impacts in sub-Saharan Africa. Then I got to grad school, and I saw all my other classmates doing development work, doing RCTs, and I was like, and I freaked out, and nothing wrong with RCTs. They're just, I think the barriers to entry to get there it's pretty high. It's very risky, and I just said, okay, so let me drop the development part and let me just focus on ag environment. And so started looking at climate change impacts. And what I realized in grad school is that you had this pretty high-profile debate with a bunch of papers in the AER, many listed here. And the whole debate was around trying to assess in a credible way how to capture long-run adaptations to climate change, so long-run impacts of climate change on agriculture. And so I cannot understand like how important these papers are in terms of like setting, for grad students, just trying to figure out like, okay, what are the important questions? So if they're in these top journals, right, they have to be important. So this guides a lot, and I guided a lot of how I thought about these questions. So my first direction, my first inclination was I have to fit somewhere in here. Like I have to, so you think about the margins of this debate and what can I actually add. So one of my first first initiatives was trying to get a closer look at this recording approach. So the recording approach, if you don't know, I think everyone would know what the recording approach is. The recording approach is basically a hedonic model of farmland values, where you're trying to recognize that, in the same way that, say, soil quality is capitalized in the value of the land, so climate, climate should also be capitalized in the same value. And you basically assume that farmers are adapted to their current climatic conditions, and then you go from there. So you try to see what is the contribution, the marginal effect of climate variables on farmland values, and you can use that to do simulations under different climate scenarios. So one thing that really struck me when I was in grad school is that I looked at some of these studies, all beautifully written, and I was amazed that you could actually find that in the eastern half of the US, the warmer areas had lower land values, conditional on a bunch of things. So that's the kitchen sink condition. So no matter what. So that meant that if you go, there should be some smooth relationship, warmer areas, lower land values. And I was just amazed that you could actually have that result. And obviously it has negative implications for climate change, especially when you have a warming world. That's sort of bad news. So one thing that I did is that I started playing around with historical land value data. So I got data from Michael Haynes, who's an economic historian, and said, is this relationship actually, does it hold when I go back in time? So one thing that I started playing around with was how are land values, farmland values, correlated with something that we think is fundamental to agricultural production, and it's soil quality. So I went back to, actually I did it going back to the first census of ag, and so what you see here is a correlation within state of soil quality, a metric of soil quality, and farmland values. And what you see is that there's a positive correlation, but then there's something happening around the 80s, late 70s, 80s, where that correlation starts to drop, okay? And it stays there. When you take more recent data, in terms of rents, so what farmers actually pay to rent the land, you actually find that the correlation is much higher with the asset value of the land. So something is happening, that the land values are changing in a way that they're sort of increasingly decoupled from a fundamental of agricultural production, okay? So to highlight where this might be coming from, in the next slide I'm going to show you the change in land value between these two time periods, okay? To see where the land values are actually going up. So the darker areas is where land values are going up. The urban counties are highlighted and they're actually blacked out. And you can see that maybe you thought well, I'm sure the Midwest, the land values are going up, agricultural productivity is going. It's actually not true. So the areas that are actually appreciating the most is not the core ag areas that we think about. And it's not even areas around cities. So if you go, say, around Chicago, outside Chicago, or Kansas City, you see that, there's actually not, the land values are not going up on this side. But you see places like, the Ozark Mountains, the outskirts of Atlanta, northern Michigan, northern Wisconsin, the Arrowhead of Minnesota. And these places actually tend to be relatively cooler areas within those states. Okay? So something is happening where land values are going up in a way that is actually correlated with climate. Okay? So when you see, so I'm going to show you another map, okay? And I'm going to do this interactively, so you have to squint a little bit, and then see whether you see some relationship between the changing housing prices during a comparable period on the right, and the changes in farmland values on the left-hand side. And what I hope that you sort of see a little bit is that they're very similar, okay? So what it looks like, at least first glance, is that rise in housing values are spilling over into the farmland market, and that is correlated with climate, okay? And it's not an easy, to control for these kind of variables, because when you look around, say, even Kansas City here, you see that the growth in housing values it doesn't show up here. So it's not only the demand, so there's not only the demand factor, there's also supply about the land, the elasticity of land that also plays in, so it's a whole mess, right? So the strategy that I had in this paper, in this project, was trying to highlight that, that the large negative effects that we attribute to warming in recent cross-sections are actually driven by things that are extraneous to the agricultural sector. So it's actually spillovers from farming. So this is actually work that is forthcoming in AJE. And so I just got the email saying I have to send them money to pay for the color figures. So this is the galley proofs, but you can actually download the data and the code So you can, do that anytime. So in a way, so an important lesson actually that I learned in this project. So I started this like 5 years ago, and it's just coming out now. So it's a long, accidented project. And one thing that I learned about like working on your own, so there's a solo author paper on a pretty controversial or contentious area in the discipline, is that it sucks. So pick your battles. Like there's some debates that you get in there and oh my God, okay, I'm not even gonna show you referee reports that I got, but so I'm happy it's done, and I'm happy that I'm thinking about new directions as well. And because, when going back to what I said is that you're trying to fit in this literature. So that was like initially when you're, very young, you try to, okay, I have to add something to what these guys are saying. But one thing that I started to realize is that, well, there's some of these questions are not that particularly policy relevant, okay? So, what do we learn? Okay, we have these estimates of these impacts. We don't know exactly where they're coming from. What else more than, okay, we have to cut emissions, like what comes out of these models? And one question that I keep hearing all the time is like, well, agriculture productivity is going up. So, what people are talking about climate change and the impacts are starting to be felt, like what, so 5. And so one thing that I thought about is like, well, is it growing in the right way? So, okay, so don't take no, so is it growing in a way that makes the agricultural sector more resilient to climatic shocks? Okay, so to answer this question, so this is a kind of new direction, is to focus on TFP data, rather that has some benefits, so I can use panel data instead of farmland values. I can use, instead of looking at cross-sectional data, I can use a panel of TFP, and has advantages relative to profit variables where, you have contracyclical movements between revenues and cost and weather shocks. Here, they're actually accounted for in the way that the inputs are capitalized and the way that the output is capitalized. So you can see the great thing about TFP is that it not only encompasses the whole ag sector, so everything is in there, but it's amazing how you can see the droughts and the bad years. So if you know a little bit about Midwestern agriculture, you can see that 1988, 83 were pretty bad years, and then you can see in the map the deviation. So you already see how the bad years look like. You can see flooding, droughts. So once you get that, you know that you have a paper to write, because like the variation is just so clear. Okay. So what we wanted to know with this is how sensitive is agriculture, globally speaking, right? Everything combined. How sensitive it is to extreme temperatures. And what we find is that, especially in the eastern half of the US, high temperatures tend to lower productivity, okay? In the west, we actually don't see that. A lot of it's irrigated. But most importantly, what we find is that this is changing over time. This relationship is changing over time, which is kind of the important question. Is it growing, but also becoming more robust, more resilient to these shocks? And so I'm just going to focus on the Midwest. We did this for every region. And what you see here is what is the implicit reduction, what is the impact of a 2-degree warming summer, like warmer summer, on TFP in an early period and a late period. So the gray bar says that if it's 2 degrees warmer, you have a drop in productivity of about 10%. Post-1980s, the same warming is a drop of 30% in productivity. So it's 3 times more sensitive. And in the paper, we actually look at what is driving this. So we find the same sort of footprint on the crop output. And not only that, we find that in the Midwest, there's a growing share of the crop output in the total output. So there's like a compounding factor of crops becoming more sensitive to extremes, and that crop output playing a bigger role in the region. So this paper you can download, the code and data too. So I was told by someone that the code looks pretty, so I'll take that as a compliment. And it was very easy to revise, so I think it was pretty modular. Okay, so I have a couple minutes left. And so one question that I'm wondering right now is, what about the rest of the world, right? So this is another question, and so population is growing, productivity is also growing, but we wanted to know whether is can we actually determine what's the contribution of recent climate change, okay, not only the future, but also recent climate change on global ag productivity. So this is work with climate scientists at Cornell, Bob Chambers and David Lobel at Stanford. And the approach, I have to jump a little bit, is basically, it's to estimate these response functions, and then I think the funky part is, so I'm gonna jump this a little bit, that once we estimate, so this is just a check that this thing should work. So I did this for the US at a national level, and we get the response function that I was expecting to get. And what we're trying to do is that we're going to use counterfactual climate scenarios. So the idea is that we want to see what would have been the growth pattern if we have the actual climate that we observe, or a counterfactual climate where you remove human influences. So this is a way of trying to use what climate scientists do to try to back out what is the accumulated effect of climate change, okay? This is like my last slide. So in terms of one of the interesting things that is happening also is that starting to work on these type of questions where it's actually metrics that international government agencies actually use, so TFP, is that you attract the attention of people that are working there, and then they say like, oh, you're working on climate, you're trying to account for climate in productivity metrics. And so I recently joined this group at the OECD. They're trying to develop a framework to account for environmental factors in official ag statistics and to account for climate. So final thoughts. So from my experience, one thing that I can encourage especially junior people is to favor directions where you believe that questions are important to many people, not just your fellow economists or academics, and because the contribution will fit somewhere, right? So just don't let the fit kind of guide exactly what you are. Just like think about the big questions, and then you think about the fit, and then just get the data and get it done. Okay. So thank you.
I should have mentioned at the beginning, basically we're going to have 3 15-minute talks and then try and get the panelists up for cumulative questions or a joint round of questions at the end. Next up is Katrina Jessoe from UC Davis. Many of you certainly know her work involving electricity or water, or maybe even some work that she's done in developing country settings. A new-ish area for her has been to move sort of into this agricultural space, particularly as it relates to the important issue of irrigation in California. Yes. So please welcome Katrina.
Thanks. Great. So thanks so much for having me today. I'm really excited to be here. I've learned a lot about ag over the past few days and its intersection with environment. So organizers, thanks for putting on a great conference. So what I want to do today is I want to tell you a little bit about why I am particularly excited about this topic of water in agriculture, and I'm calling it a beginner's interest in this classic topic because I am very much the beginner. This is kind of a new research area for me. So what I want to do is I want to tell you why I'm interested in this area, how I got interested in this area. I want to walk you through why I'm interested through a running example, and then I'm going to hit on a few other papers on this topic and finish up with some final thoughts. Yeah. I'm not quite loud enough. Okay. So let me I have my little notes here. Okay. So I think the first is that you can ask questions that are of pressing and current policy importance. Second, I find the setting of water and ag to be one where you can really test kind of some of like the fundamental things you're learning in either Micro 101 or in a classic environmental economics class. So it's really kind of, I think about it as a bit of like kind of a petri dish with which to kind of test or kind of grow out some of these kind of economic principles and assumptions. The third thing is, once you start to delve into the details of water and ag, there's a lot of kind of really rich and nuanced institutional settings. And what I find is when I kind of really kind of dive into kind of those details, the regulatory details, or the details of the setting, a lot of kind of interesting research questions emerge, as well as empirical approaches and research designs. And then the fourth thing I find really exciting is that there's new data, and these new data allow for fresh empirical investigations. So how did I get started working on this topic? Well, I was teaching my PhD course in environmental economics, and we were talking a lot about climate change, right? Climate change and impact assessment and climate change and adaptation. And almost all the focus of these conversations or the literature was on adaptation to warming temperatures, right? Adaptation to warming temperatures. And kind of the elephant in the room in my mind was how we're going to adapt to changing water supplies. The second thing that kind of started me thinking about this was in California, we were in the midst of this historic drought. And the way we were dealing with this historic drought, one main avenue through which we've dealt with this historic drought, and we continue to kind of regulate water, is through the channel of residential water use. Now, in California, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Why? Because about 80% of human consumption of water comes from the agricultural sector, right? So you're trying to kind of get all of your reductions from this kind of one sector, residential use, where often the willingness to pay in this setting is a lot higher. So it got me thinking about water and ag, right? So this is how I started thinking about it. But it wasn't really in this kind of refined way. It was in this more kind of general way. And so then I started down a research agenda, and I was fortunate enough to meet Ellen Bruno, who is this awesome PhD student at our department who's now at Berkeley. And we started talking a lot about groundwater. And so what I want to do is I want to talk about why I think this area is exciting through the context of this kind of paper or project I'm working on that looks at the efficiency gains from groundwater markets. So, piece one, why do I think this is a pressing and important policy question? So kind of here's my motivation on this paper. So with climate change, we're going to see changing water supplies. So there's going to be warmer temperatures, sea level rise, more frequent and extreme weather events. And typically, we focused on the economic costs of warming temperatures and the role that adaptation will play. However, and this is a lot in the context of California, climate change is going to also dramatically impact water supplies through the conduit of increased temperatures. So we're going to see changes in the form of precipitation. Less snow, more rain. We're going to see changes in the timing of the water supply, so this kind of earlier melting of the snowpack. We're also going to experience more variable precipitation, so more frequent and severe droughts, as well as an increase in floods. And we may possibly see an increased reliance on groundwater supplies. So droughts historically have been strongly correlated with an increase in groundwater use. So the way a lot of agriculture compensated or responded to reductions in surface water supplies with the recent drought was through an increased reliance on groundwater use. Okay, so that was the kind of, that's the the policy relevance, right? So kind of bullet one. Bullet two was kind of, you can test questions of what I think about as kind of fundamental economic importance, or kind of things you can learn in Micro 101, or kind of intro micro. So what we're interested in this paper in doing is we're interested in thinking about water markets as an adaptation strategy. So water markets, or the establishment of water markets as a tool to mitigate the costs of climate change. So why could water markets substantially lower abatement costs? Well, this could happen through a few reasons, or through a few ways. First, in California, in response to the drought, there was this 25% conservation mandate. So all residential users had to reduce their water, or all kind of, water utilities had to reduce their water by, on average, by about 25%. And you can imagine that the cost of complying with this mandate could have been dramatically reduced had urban users been allowed to trade with agricultural users in a meaningful way. You can also imagine that the cost to comply with this mandate could have been reduced if trade had been allowed between urban users. You can also imagine that water markets may substantially lower abatement costs, and I think this is a ripe area for research right here. I should point out kind of that we don't know a ton about, between agricultural users. So in California, SGMA's coming down the line. This is the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and it was passed in 2014. And what it's going to require is for all groundwater basins to monitor and maintain stable groundwater levels. What the act doesn't specify is how you're going to get at this. And so water markets may pack a huge punch here, right? You can get at kind of compliance with this mandate through trade. The last thing I want to say is that another advantage of water markets is that there's huge allocative inefficiencies in kind of the allocation of water in California. And so you can imagine opening up the market to trade, even in the absence of curtailments or mandatory curtailments, could lead to huge efficiency gains, right? Because you could kind of move water from those with a lower willingness to pay for it to those with a higher willingness to pay for it. So those are kind of my first 2 points. Now, I think what's interesting about work at the interface of kind of water and agriculture is that there's a lot here, right? Kind of, I feel like the work I'm doing is really building on a long and rich history in this area of research. So by no means am I claiming to be the first in any way. Instead, I'm kind of taking advantage of what kind of new data are kind of buying me to apply these modern empirical tools to these questions. And so I'm really kind of standing on the shoulders of these kind of giants in the field. So there's this really rich theoretical programming and structural literature on the role of water markets and their importance that they can play in terms of kind of moving agricultural water around and kind of the efficiency gains from these markets. However, moving from theory to actual estimates has been really, really challenging. And kind of I've identified I think there are kind of a few hurdles that have made this challenging. The first is that existing trades involve these substantial or these huge transaction costs. So if you can imagine moving water from Northern California to Southern California, there's huge legal, administrative, and physical costs involved. So if you observe a water trade, it's really hard to think about kind of what fraction kind of that trade kind of reflects kind of the willingness to pay and what fraction actually represents kind of the transaction costs. So it's difficult to net out the transaction costs. The second empirical hurdle is that if you want to try to get a sense of the gains from trade, kind of one key ingredient in trying to kind of simulate those is kind of credible estimates of the price elasticity of demand for agricultural groundwater. So why is this hard? Well, if you're going to do this in a really kind of transparent, direct way, it's rare to observe kind of well-level groundwater data, well-level data on groundwater use, and then over kind of with kind of enough kind of cross-sectional units of observation or of enough kind of a temporal duration in which to actually kind of pin stuff down. The second is that if you are fortunate enough to be endowed with this type of data set, typically there's an absence of volumetric pricing for water. So it's really difficult to kind of do this kind of classic regression where you regress, water use on prices because either there's not prices or you can't observe water use. So what kind of has historically been done is when these panel data are available, they use, when panel data on groundwater use are available, what people typically do is they proxy for the price of groundwater extraction using a combination of electricity prices and aquifer depth. Okay, so that's kind of how I view my approach to this paper, right? I'm building on kind of the work of others, and I'm just bringing kind of a new perspective to bear on it. I'm adding in kind of one deliberate way. So what are we going to do in our paper? We're going to develop this simple conceptual model to measure the gains from trade. We're then going to go in and we're going to estimate the price elasticity of demand for agricultural groundwater use. So here comes in bullet 3, kind of getting a sense of the setting in which you're working. So we were really kind of picky here, and we went out and we looked at all these different water districts in California, and we found a few where they actually monitor groundwater use and where they have volumetric pricing for water. And we kind of bored down on these water districts, and we finally got access to these data. So we're going to be looking at this question in an area or water district where there's 3 volumetric water pricing regimes for groundwater use in a single district, and where there's monthly groundwater extraction data for each individual well spanning 17 years. The research design that we're going to use is we're going to use the quasi-random assignment of wells to a pricing regime. So what do I mean by that? Well, with the data we have, we're now also allowed to bring some kind of more modern empirical tools to bear. So the case we're just trying to make here is what I've plotted is we have average well level water use in each month for 2 regions. So these are 2 regions within a single water district that face different prices. What I'm plotting here is their mean groundwater use before we introduced volumetric pricing. So this is the mean water use in 2 districts before the introduction of groundwater pricing. And what you see is they're balanced. And we think this provides some evidence kind of that assignment to a pricing regime is independent of potential outcomes. What we find, I should say, okay, now back to the kind of previous slide. And so what we're going to do is we're going to grab this price elasticity estimate and we're going to throw it into a simulation that we're going to use to calculate the welfare gains from a water market with ag to urban water trading. Now, the second thing we're able to do, and again, this was kind of getting smart on the institutions, is that we're able to do this in an area where urban and agricultural users grab all their water from the exact same aquifer in the same county. So we're able to kind of overcome some of these kind of administrative hurdles that could plague kind of other settings. So what we find, and I just want to highlight this very quickly. So we find a few things. What we find is that there's huge gains from trade. So on flush left, we have the conservation policy. We have a 10% conservation mandate. Flush right, we have a 30% conservation mandate. This means combined ag and urban users have to reduce their water use by the given percentage. Blue, we plot out the percentage change in surplus from different conservation mandates, and on red, the red dotted line, we show the fraction of abatement done by ag. So what we find is that the introduction of a water market kind of leads to huge increases in surplus, and almost all the abatement is coming from agriculture. And this is reflective of huge kind of initial pricing distortions between ag and urban users, where urban users at the start are paying about 10 times the price of ag users for water. Okay, so I'm not the only one working in this field, right? There's a lot of new perspectives on classic questions. So we see work on property rights, on the role of transaction costs, on the benefits of markets, on water availability and agricultural development. And this is just a partial list, I should say. So what are some other new directions in this topic? Well, on my reading list is Nick's paper that he presented yesterday, which looks at long-run adaptation to water scarcity. And again, I think he kind of has this like exciting recipe, right? So what he's done is he's gotten smart on the institutions, and he kind of shows us that you have two farms. They neighbor each other. One's in irrigation district A, one's in irrigation district B. And because of that, they get very different water deliveries, panel A. The impact of that, or the outcome of that, great, is that they have very different agricultural outcomes, right? So he got smart on the institutional settings, he took advantage of this discontinuity, and then he added to it kind of some really rich land use data. And what this allows for combined is it allows for kind of the application of this really transparent kind of empirical strategy to ask a question of huge policy importance and economic importance. Another paper on my reading list is Fiona Lewis's and Matt's paper on what I think about as the price elasticity of demand for agricultural electricity and for agricultural groundwater. The other thing that they're asking in an earlier version of this paper, I'm not sure in the current version of this paper, is they were doing this really interesting thing where they were thinking about the pumping cost externality. If I draw a unit of water from my well, what's kind of the impact on the pumping cost for all my neighboring users? And how they're doing this is they're using well-level electricity use, plus they have data from electricity use from every single PG&E customer, right? So they get at this kind of concern that we have in our paper on external validity, and they have this amazing variation in prices. So again, it's kind of this magic recipe of what I think is exciting. On my to-do list, and I'll just wrap up with this point. So one thing I want to do is I want to take a breath, literally and kind of a bit more kind of metaphorically. And what I mean by that is we're all kind of barreling down the pipeline, kind of taking advantage of these new data sets. And sometimes maybe kind of there's some hazard lights that we should be paying attention to that we aren't. And I want to walk through this with kind of some work that I'm doing right now. So in this paper, what we're looking at is we're looking at water prices. Sorry, that was my timer. In a separate irrigation district and its impact on land use. And we've gotten at land use using kind of three different data sets. The first is the USDA CDL land that we typically think about. The second is that the irrigation district in which we're working with, every year they go out and they actually survey the land. And so kind of on a given kind of landowner's property, they take different kind of fields and classify, you have some strawberries, you have some raspberries, you have some other stuff. And then there's this for-profit company called Land IQ that's been doing these really kind of detailed data sets of what's being grown every year. And so what we started with is we started using the CDL data, but we weren't quite satisfied. So then we went to the survey data we have, as well as the Land IQ data. So what we've plotted here is we've plotted kind of a bit of a horse race or a comparison of what the survey data, that's the bottom line, is showing, and what the land use, the CDL data, is showing. And what you find, sorry, this is kind of messy, but what you find is that the land use survey data, there's 154 instances in which the land use survey data tells us that raspberries or blackberries are being used. But the CDL data tells us that it's grass or pasture. And so what's gotten me thinking about are kind of what are the limitations of some of these data sets? What can they bias and what can't they bias? So kind of I have to kind of slow down a bit to think about this. So for new directions, noodling them over, nothing firm here. This is just kind of what I'm thinking about without any concrete research kind of questions in mind, is I think there's a lot of work to be done on adaptation and technology adoption. I think I'd really love to see a paper on the long run price elasticity of demand. I'm also thinking a lot now about storage. So I'm thinking a lot about there's floods, there's droughts. Storage is going to be a huge mode of adaptation. Kind of what would contracts look like around that? How's storage going to play in adaptation? And again, I don't have anything really firm to say, but that's kind of what's percolating in my head. And I'd love to see some people try to kind of chip away at that. So thanks.
Okay, next up we have Frank Lupi. Frank is at Michigan State. Many of you probably know Frank. Frank is an alum, a repeat offender at the U of I think, which is great. It's good to have him back on campus. Maybe this can substitute for that seminar he's been wanting to give that I haven't been able to get him down here for. But Frank is a very, very well-known expert in non-market valuation, especially with respect to recreational demand and the involvement of especially fisheries and things like that, but also hunting and any number of other topics. He does a lot of work related directly to agriculture. And the last thing I'll say about Frank is that he has wonderful, wonderful comments that are always very helpful and insightful. And as a young faculty member, as a student before that, always been very, very helpful, and it's always good when he's in the audience, whether you're junior or senior, in terms of getting the feedback and the ideas that Frank has. So Frank, come on up.
All right, thanks, Ben, and everybody. This is a great conference. As Ben said, this is sort of a little bit of a homecoming for me. So I did my undergrad in econ here. I didn't know anything about agriculture. I'm from the Chicago suburbs. And then I did a master's degree in ag econ. So a little bit of this reminds me I saw Stop Making Sense across the street when I was an undergrad many times. And so how did I get here? So in my master's program, I actually worked on cost-effective ways to reduce sediment loads in a lake in Illinois, where the Lake Association was paying these farmers to do it. That was work with John Braden. It was like a neat, cozy and little bargain, and that was 30 years ago. So then I left, and I've been doing a lot of non-market valuation. I'm an extension economist. At Michigan State University, I work with the State Department of Natural Resources. And so I work on issues related to resources they manage. They manage parks, beaches, fish, and wildlife, those kinds of things. So a lot of my work there was in non-market valuation and demand for those services and habitat and all sorts of things like that. Okay, but that led me a little bit back towards agriculture because non-point source pollution affects many of those resources, particularly things like beaches, which we've heard about several times at this conference. Here's a slide from one of my colleagues. I do a lot of interdisciplinary work, and I'm going to touch on some of that today, trying to put together models to understand ag pollution's effect on ecosystem services. Dave Hyman, a hydrologist at Michigan State, estimated phosphorus loadings throughout the lower peninsula of Michigan. And if you see on this line, the vast majority of these phosphorus loadings are coming from ag sources, right? Clean Water Act put the screws on the point sources, but we have all these non-point source loadings. So loadings matter if you're worried about things that are affected by some of these pollutants like phosphorus. In these freshwater systems, phosphorus is a limiting nutrient. Nitrogen plays a role, but it's not like it does in saltwater systems. So that's some of the background of the journey back towards ag. There's, again, people in this room like Scott Swinton who have worked on these issues with me and others, a lot of people. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about, it's a lot of other people's work like Elena's and others. She nicely had a list. I was too lazy to try and figure that out. But this is a diagram that informs a lot of my thinking on this topic of phosphorus from a review paper that Scott and others and I wrote. And we tried to be clever, the P puzzle. P meaning phosphorus, right? We're being recorded. Anyhow, so There's a lot of elements to this system, but it's a basic sort of diagram we're familiar with, is how do we get from the actions of people on the land to the consequences of those, and how do we evaluate policies? We need to put these pieces together. So some of my work that I'm going to draw upon today is trying to build integrated assessment models for Michigan to do some of that work. So this is a standard kind of coupled human natural system diagram. We're trying to model crops, the behavior that drives things like phosphorus applications. We're linking that to a crop growth model, linking that to a hydrologic model. We're not using SWOT, we're using a different hydrological model, but it's a similar kind of process. If you work in this space, there's a lot of efforts to try and do this. In particular, we're focused on then linking those pollutants downstream and in lakes and in the Great Lakes to various ecosystem services. So then we're modeling ecosystem service production as a function of phosphorus. So instead of linking phosphorus directly to downstream things like people going to beaches, we're actually modeling the things that are affected by phosphorus. So we have maybe some uniqueness here is we have a lot of these ecological production functions. Okay, so that's a diagram. So one element of this brings me back to how do we understand why producers are using the amounts of phosphorus that they are, and what do we know about the price elasticity of that? So we're trying to build a modeling system that we can answer counterfactual questions. Right? Ag policy, we pay farmers to do stuff. But we can ask questions like Elena did, well, what if we use incentive-based mechanisms? What if we price phosphorus, tax it? You get a more cost-effective solution. So if you want to answer questions like that, you need to start by modeling producer behavior. And there's all sorts of challenges when you put these models together. Elena touched on some of them, but you have different spatial units, different temporal units. Hydrologists are modeling things on the hour in 30-minute grids or 30-meter grids on the landscape. I can get data on ag production at county levels. I mean, there's a gross mismatch in spatial scales. There's lots of challenges to that, but I want to focus on one. What's our underlying model of farmer behavior? I mean, I'm an economist, right? I got a master's degree here at Illinois. Producers maximize profits subject to some budget constraints. Maybe they care about the environment. In my survey work with Scott and others, farmers do care about the environment. So they maximize utility, and blah, blah, blah. They care about the environment, they care about profits. So we have this underlying rational behavior that we're going to model. So let me comment on that. We did a survey last year. This is a survey of corn farmers in Michigan, several thousand people. We sent them an invitation, pushed them to web. Please go to this website. Here's $5. We didn't have football tickets, but who would we pick? Michigan, Michigan State. So we got 30% response rate. That's pretty good. Also, I just want you to know you can push farmers to do surveys on the web. So that worked pretty well. A lot of people told us we couldn't. But we got a lot of underlying crop management information from this. Okay, one of the things we got is we asked people about their soil phosphorus levels. So about 60% of the farmers, 65% of the farmers in our survey do soil tests, and most of those were able to report what their soil phosphorus level is. This is important if we think about phosphorus management, because phosphorus in the soil is like a stock, and you draw from it when you're growing crops. So these white dots are the people that didn't know what their phosphorus levels were, but all these dots, except for that red dot, are levels of phosphorus stock in the soil that are kind of above what you need to grow corn. So only 5% of the people in our sample were kind of in that area where the agronomy literature, our agronomists and the field trials say they're going to need phosphorus to get response to their crop growth. Why? Why are those soil stocks so high? I don't have an answer to that. I think it's a really interesting question. In some ways, it may seem to sort of contradict. It costs money to apply phosphorus, right? So there's lots of possible explanations. We're eliciting risk attitudes. Maybe it's a risk response. Maybe farmers don't know the exact nature of the production function. That's sort of surprising, but maybe. All right, so this is part of an RCT we're doing. We took all that data on those farmers' applications and their field information, and we divided people up, and we sent some of them information treatments. We actually ran their field through a crop simulator, and we printed out for farmers in the treatment graphs for their field of what their crop response to ag is. And this was actually astonishing to me, because I've been working for a while with an agronomist who says farmers are over-applying phosphorus. And, I'm like, yeah, well, maybe. But, so what this shows is at different levels of soil stock for phosphorus, there's virtually no response of yields to adding more phosphorus, okay? So, look, why? It costs money to do this. Why are we seeing this? And only at really quite low soil stocks and at low application rates is there a response to phosphorus. And this wasn't just this farmer. This is characteristic of most all of the simulations we did with the crop model. So this is a huge puzzle to me. So maybe we'll get lucky in our little RCT where we sent these people information will change behavior. On the other hand, we sent that information right like a month before a disastrous corn season. And this may just be a bust, right? It was a very, very atypical wet season. Farmers weren't doing sort of their typical practices. And it does remind me as an assistant professor of when I mailed out 8,000 wetland surveys in white envelopes the day before the anthrax scare. Winning. Anyhow, but this is a big puzzle. I don't have a super strong background in agriculture, and this confuses me completely. So I want to model farmer behavior, but so let me change topics. Another area I've worked a lot on is measuring water quality. Some quick thoughts. If you look across various efforts to value water quality, a whole lot of the stated preference work and some of the revealed preference work either uses this water quality ladder, or it uses a water quality index that was developed in part by EPA some 30 years ago or so. And sometimes we'll just use the underlying physical measures of water quality. Oh, let me just say this before I back up. That slide I presented with the crop yields, that's preliminary work, obviously, so please take that for what it is. Like Braden, I might disavow it. So here's what one of the problems with a lot of that work is. A single valued index that tells people about what happens when water quality changes, okay? But the problem is water quality is a bunch of things, and there's different services that are affected by that. So it does not move monotonically, right? If you're interested in bass fishing, then you want a water body that's optimized that looks very different than if you're interested in swimming. And just an extreme example, just think about a swimming pool and a place where you can catch a lot of fish, right? So as you improve the clarity, reduce the nutrient loads, some of those services will go down. They don't move the same way. So a lot of my work has been to sort of separate those out. That's why we have ecological production functions instead of a single index like this. Now, I understand that if you want to build meta-analyses for benefit transfer, you need to be sort of having a consistent basis for this. So there's a good reason for doing work with the WQI, but it's not perfect for the task. So instead, we've been building these ecological production functions, working with ecologists. Real quick, I'm going to touch on a few of them, but we have many. I'm going to talk first about fish biomass, and then I'm going to talk a bit about algae. So fish biological modeling, what we've been doing is you take data on fish sampling that the DNR, Department of Natural Resources, has done, and we try to estimate the production of fish as a function of things like water temperature, but also phosphorus. So we're building models from the ground up that relate the nutrient loading to the ecological service. Anglers go out, they go fishing, they're going fishing. Are they really demanding directly phosphorus or water clarity? If you talk to them, they're going fishing. So we model fish biomass. I know there's other ways to do this in the rec demand literature. So here's what we do, and we do it for separate species, and we do it for different water bodies, because fish respond differently in rivers than they do in lakes, than the Great Lakes. So we have a whole bunch of these biological models. Here's what I want to point out. Even the different fish species respond differently to different levels of phosphorus. Trout are intolerant. They'll disappear first at high levels of phosphorus. Panfish, at least in the range of relevant data in Michigan, can tolerate a very, very high level of phosphorus. So the mix of species is changing. It's not just the single index, it's even within a suite of services that things change. So, all right, we've linked all those to recreation demand models. I do a lot of recreation demand modeling, so that's probably no surprise. We have a model that relates where people go fishing on rivers to all the individual specific biomasses on those segments of rivers. This is nice because biomass is a fishery-independent metric of ecosystem services. It's not like a catch rate. I've done stuff with catch rates, but catch rates are amount per unit of effort. But my demand model is modeling effort. So catch rates are endogenous. Biomass is not. We've done the same thing for lakes. So these are big repeated RUM models with 1,600 lakes and 200 some rivers. So we have those systems. Everything's linked to phosphorus. So we can do that for fish. Similarly, we can do it for beaches. Great Lakes beaches, if you're not sure and you don't know, the beaches in Michigan, way better than Ohio. And hardly any HABs. So HABs are not a big issue in most of the Michigan beaches, but we do have some algae-related issues that's related to phosphorus, in particular macroalgae, filamentous large algae like Cladophora. That's my colleague Jan outside of his summer home. I got to get one of those summer home things. But if you do, sometimes these Cladophora mats will wash up, and you could be like this lady, I paid $500,000 for this property. So there's a nice hedonic study. We're not doing the hedonics, but we're relating where people go to beaches to this filamentous macroalgae. And again, I'm a rec demand modeler, so we're doing that with big, large-scale models, 450 publicly accessible Great Lakes beaches, all that demand linked to different levels of water quality, algae. All those algae models are a function of phosphorus. So we're putting these pieces together. So what's the story? It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of different funding sources. There's different challenges. You might get cut off while you're trying to talk by Ben. So I think one of the things I like about what we're doing is we're not doing benefits transfer. We're building these models that are at their beginning linked to what we're trying to measure. A paper that you should read that I'm not going to have time to talk about is a great PNAS paper by David Kaiser and Kathy and Joseph Shapiro. Really nice analysis in here, discussion of the differences between the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. A couple real quick. First of all, most of the benefit cost analyses for water quality improvement have costs that are greater than their estimated benefits. So the early low-hanging fruit, the safety that was captured by some of the initial drinking water things, those things pass a benefit cost analysis. Why? Most of these subsequent things aren't having a big impact on health. Health drives air pollution estimates. It doesn't drive water pollution estimates, or we got it wrong. We don't have the right information. Another big point. So with water pollution now, we take drinking water out of the equation. People have to expose themselves. We all breathe air, but not everybody has contact, right? So that's where these recreation demand models are, in a sense, how people are getting exposed. So that affects the magnitude of the benefits we're going to get out of this. So let me come back and I'll close. So I really like what Elena and some others are doing to build in better models of the economy on some of these. A lot of my work's been on valuation, and you see some real kind of, let's say, crummy impact, input-output type analyses to get at what's happening on their side. These Great Lake beaches in Michigan, they get 20 million trips a year. There's clearly some producer surplus tied to changes in the quality associated with visitation of those beaches, but it would be great to have a CGE to work on that. Let me go back to where I started here. I was working on non-point source pollution here. This is 30 years. I'm looking at that literature now. People are still working on cost-effective targeting. We rely, our almost only instrument is to pay farmers. And it takes a lot of time to do these modelings. The modelings are way better. The model we had for our sediment delivery, it was garbage 30 years ago. The models are better, but they're still not easy to apply. So last question, absent those market forces on cost, we can do a lot of work on valuing the benefits of water quality change, but where's that impetus, where's that pressure to drive those costs down with technological change? Thank you.
Frank, want to come up here? Have a seat? Do it. Yes, great.
You're all just blown away.
I'll start. Maybe a softball question for the three of you, but each of you kind of touched in one way or another on factors that potentially could be outside the realm of traditional economics in terms of interest. So for example, political economy issues. In the California water market example, you had transaction costs, but it goes well beyond that. When we think about getting water from the north to the south, for example, or in Frank's case, and thinking about the behavioral aspects of this. Madhu and I just had this conversation right before lunch. All the CGE models and other models, it's all based on profit maximization. If we're really serious about behavioral aspects, how do we really account for those in our models? So it's kind of a general question about, if we think about beyond just kind of strict economic profit maximization or even utility maximization, how do we account for some of these other things that we know matter, but are problematic in terms of how we account for them in our models?
That's a softball.
Yeah. I'll take a swing and a miss at that softball. I don't have an answer. I wrote a grant proposal to do positive math programming to calibrate, an ag supply model to some of these issues, and the underlying, the requirement then to properly calibrate that is that the behavior is rational. I don't have a good answer.
I guess for me, it kind of thinking about it in terms of like a question of kind of even like for my stuff, like the scale of it. So I think I try to start very kind of bottom down in the sense that I wanted to find a place where I could try to hopefully remove all those like political economy considerations and show that water markets perform well. And then say, okay, now let's add on the next layer of complexity. So kind of try to isolate one thing at a time. I think for me, sometimes in my own research, I get overwhelmed when there's so many things to ask at once. And so if I can kind of really zoom in on trying to get at one thing well, but knowing how it fits into that broader puzzle, right? So it's like I can say one specific thing well, and then how does it fit into that broader puzzle? And then, and I think a nice kind of complement to my stuff is Fiona and Lewis and Matt's stuff, because a negative on mine is that you can't get at external validity, like how much does this result apply more broadly? And then they can really chip away at that, but can't speak to other things. And so I think maybe if each person can tackle one piece of it and then assemble it and hopefully get at some of those kind of more meta questions or bigger kind of non-econ kind of considerations.
So my point is more about the collaborations with climate scientists. So there's things that, there's no good counterfactuals of, right? What would be the climate without human forcing, like without CO2? Climate scientists actually come up with those. So if we want to answer that question, then we have to rely on the state of the art in another discipline to get that counterfactual and tie it into what I can do, which is my empirical modeling. So maybe economists don't think about that as a valid counterfactual, but many scientists do. And if that's the question we want to answer, then we have to, take the best swing that we can at a question. And that requires many times, using expertise and things that are acceptable to other disciplines that maybe economists don't think, like, well, that's not that interesting, right? But I think they're very important, so.
So this is kind of building upon what Elena was saying, and also the presentation that she made yesterday about, the kind of difference between straight econ and kind of non-straight econ, like ag econ people. Like, I think I have two questions, both positive and, normative. Like how has the relationship between kind of straight econ and ag econ been changing over the years, and then also looking forward? Is there any methodologies from other fields that might inform ag research or the other way around? So I think one of the cases that I was thinking about, I talked with Nick yesterday, was about like some firms kind of getting into this water trade market. Like Harvard bought up a lot of vineyards in California, and a lot of local communities were so like agitated about it, and what will be the implication of that for kind of allocating those water rights over time in the future. Just those questions.
So I'll take a swing. So I think things are, in my view, things are changing, and it depends on the type of research that departments value and deans value, and so say that work that you might I don't know if I'm trying to take interpret your question in a certain way. I don't know exactly if I'm going to answer exactly what you said, but there's work that is more prone to be published in PNAS, Science, Nature. Others are so I think that having a portfolio approach is important in applied econ programs, and as long as there's outlets there that and people who value the diversity of these contributions, then I think there's no market failure, right? So yeah.
I guess in terms of how I think it's changing, or what advice I would give, it's probably not the right advice. I don't know if I followed my own advice, but I don't know if I would tell other people to follow it. So I think, we kind of get into this profession and do research because we love it. And so I think to remain strong as a researcher, you have to, at its core, love the research you're doing, right? And if you don't, you're not going to be a good researcher, and you're just not going to kind of value your job anymore. So I just try to do the research that I like to do, for better or worse. I published in the places that I wanted to publish, for better or worse. It ended up being okay, but I think kind of at the end of the day, if it ends up not working out, at least it didn't work out because I was kind of sticking true to the research that I liked and my research agenda, and not deviating from that. I think another thing that helped me in my career, in terms of kind of what the department values, is not even just what the department values, but kind of what my communities value. So what that means for me is the environmental and resource economist community, and also what that meant for me was kind of the California water community. So I really get along with all the folks working in water at Davis, and so we would just kind of talk shop and hang out and chit chat, and so just making sure that they value what I'm doing, and that I wanted kind of my environment and resource kind of colleagues to value what I was doing. So.
Yeah, it's hard for me to comment about what's changed in terms of differences between econ and applied econ departments, because obviously I'm not constant. So personally, I do more interdisciplinary work. I think it came up yesterday that can be risky for younger people, and I think even more so in an econ department. I've been relatively fortunate that my college doesn't penalize the kind of work that I'm doing, but I'm an atypical example because I'm also in another department, a fisheries and wildlife department, and so the difference between econ and ag econ is close to zero compared to that cultural change, but that hasn't, for me, it hasn't been an impediment to have that mix.
Just to add, like you just look at the who's the staff, like who's being hired at the departments, and then it's a mixture. So you have people with PhD in econ, PhD in ag and resource economics, or PhD in public policy. So it sort of shows that and applied programs are open to this different type of contribution. So.
So just wanted to come back to your last slide, Frank. You've been working, you noted that, you started this work on on-point pollution 30 years ago, and you come back to it, and, not a lot has changed. And so what do you think is the contribution that economists can make to this literature? Is it more, yes, our data is improving, our models are improving, and therefore we can, make more accurate predictions and all of that, but is it really at that margin of the work that we could be doing in this area, or do you think there are major new contributions we could make? And I mean, I can think of a couple, but I thought, see what your thoughts are on where the major contributions can be going forward in this non-point pollution literature.
Yeah, so there's lots of marginal contributions, improving the modeling, things like that, the connectivity to services that are actually being affected by policy. I do think there is a big need for this kind of information. It may not, be a glamorous new frontier, but policymakers need that information. Certainly our state, Ohio, these are folks that want information about this, and it's not something that's being handled well. Let's say, there's a gap there, at least at the federal level. But I do think, again, there just has to be some way to work on other kinds of policies. And I picked the cost side of it because it's not clear to me that paying people to do stuff gives them a big incentive to do it cheaper. And if the crop models are right, there's some low-hanging fruit as to how to do it cheaper.